and look forward to having a conversation, hopefully with the crowd out here. Um, I think as we look into 2023 and kind of where the status of what we're seeing across the industry at this point is the value of being able to identify, measure, and communicate risk up to the board level and out to our business partners has become even more important. I believe with budget constraints and resource constraints and the just the world we live in today, if you do not have a good understanding of where your risk are coming from, how you're measuring what that impact of that risk is to the business in business language, and being able to put it into a quantitative number and move it forward, it is going to be very difficult to it's going to be difficult, very difficult to get the spending and the funding and the resources that you need moving forward. I think it's been something we've been talking about as an industry for the last, at least the last 5 years, very heavily. It's becoming more and more important that we are communicating in this business language, which is risk, right? It's risk and revenue at risk. So I think building out a program and being able to do this is a number one priority for me, and it's one of the first things I always look at when I come into a new role or how to improve that communication going forward. So it's got to become a living, breathing type of data collection. uh, when you look at how you're going to start this, I think some of the best things is we really get back into some of the basics of what makes a good cybersecurity program and what makes a good risk program is understanding what we have, right? So it kind of starts at an initial inventory. It kind of you start with what the business needs to know and how they make money. And so we can start taking that step back to build out our key risk indicators based off that. So I think it's a great place to start is just getting that and that very first foundational of what applications, what systems, who the business stakeholders are the main revenue lines, main drivers coming into our business. How do we track that, right? Do we know if application A is a primary driver of our business and the primary revenue stream? Do we understand all the pieces uh, from an inventory asset management standpoint? Do we understand all the pieces that will roll up into that application? And then do we have the governance in place to be able to look at that and measure how effective our program is being? And you can go out there and get a lot of things nowadays, and you can see this in our industry, right? Everybody's moving to risk communication. Seems like every product that's on the market today somehow has risk in it. What I advocate is getting away from the red, green, yellow way of measuring risk and actually putting real numbers on that. And I don't think you can do that generically. I think you have to use information from your system, intelligence, if so to call it, from your system, put context on that, and build out key risk indicators that mean something to your business and to your teams and to your partners, right? You can't just say, well, ransomware is the number one risk. Well, how does ransomware affect us? What would be the impact of it? What are all the pieces that we have in place that may mitigate that risk or may keep it from spreading, or we at high risk because our end user desktops have direct access to our server backend, for example. So we may want to put a high risk on that. And if we have all our applications and systems grouped together in risk rank, we can then build out key risk indicators, our own key risk indicators that allow us to measure that and say, well, this is a high risk. We are going to spend $1,000 to protect $100,000 worth of revenue. And I'm using that, just generalized numbers because math, I don't like doing math this early in the day. So try to keep those as simple as possible and move those forward. So that is one of my biggest components of that is just going through and figuring out how we're going to group those systems together and how we're going to move it. What I suggest to everybody is find a framework that works for you and start with that. So when you're building out these risk programs and doing this, ISO is a great the ISO platform has a great information risk management program. NIST has a great information risk management program, frameworks out there that you can look at and start building out a risk profile, right? Risk platform. I think one of the biggest things that you've got to be able to do is look at those frameworks though, and you can't. It's very difficult just to pull them out and say we're going to do this. We're going to throw this framework out there and we're going to stand it up and we're going to go out here and collect all this data and we're going to put it all together and know what we're doing. I will give you hard lessons learned is that it takes a lot of people to do it manually and it takes a lot of effort to get that built into something that people understand. So I always tell everybody is look at those frameworks and then customize them to your environment, because if you're trying to just grab one and slam it in, it's probably going to fail. It's probably going to fail the first time because it is taking way too big of a bite right off the bat. And you really do need to roll this in and phase it in as much as possible. And then again, it goes back to the basics. I can't build a risk management program if I don't understand what I'm protecting. I think some of the basic things that are missing from a risk management approach or from trying to implement one of these programs is not having a great asset inventory. And that asset inventory, and I use the term asset loosely, right? Because most people, when you think of asset inventory, you're thinking of a lot of times you're thinking of the servers, the infrastructure, the piece behind it. Well, asset, truthfully, in today's world, it's a lot of things, right? It's the data, it's the people, it's an API, it's an identity. So there are multiple pieces going into this, and if you do not have a good understanding of how all that comes together to attack and look at that, you can never truly measure the risk that's coming at it. It is it's always a challenge. It's always interesting when you come in and you go, well, we've got a great risk management program, and you get a spreadsheet and you look at it and it has a lot of data on it that you realize is stale and has not been updated in a while because it becomes a real check the box thing. And if you're only building out a risk management program to check a box, you are doing you and your company a disservice. A risk, what you really should be doing is it should be fluid, it should be dynamic, it should be updated and measured on a regular basis. I think one of the things that our business or our industry struggles with a little bit is the fact that traditionally our risk assessments, if we are doing them in house, they become a infrequent type of thing. You might be doing them quarterly. A lot of times it's done annually, and we're talking point in time. Or you're relying on my risk management program as being done by an outside assessor, right? Again, point in time, being done by maybe an outside team who is asking people questions. And my biggest concern with the way we do this the way we have been doing this to this day is it is very easy for that data to become we'll call it corrupt, right? Not necessarily intentionally, but what you wind up with is if you're asking questions of people and asking them to explain to you how a firewall is configured, or if that's the way they're configured, and most people, they want to be able to help, they may not have the visibility or understand the importance of the quality of what they tell you, but what they're trying to do is get that work off their plate. So they go, yeah, all our firewalls are configured exactly the same. These settings are done. And if you don't go back and validate that data in a way that allows you to look at the entire data set and monitor when things are changed, I think you're never going to have the fidelity that you really want to have in your risk measurement program, right? And I think that's why what I'm happy to see the industry moving towards a lot of our tooling out there. There are now some startups out there that have built tools specifically for this. So moving a little away from our traditional GRC platforms. So the Archers, the Salesforces of the world, or I mean, ServiceNows of the world, and where we manually upload a lot of data into these, but it's done off of essentially one of my pet peeves, the old security questionnaire or personnel interview, where we're just asking people to fill out a bunch of data. We put it into a spreadsheet. We look at it and go, okay, well, we know where everything's at. When in reality, we should be moving more, I think, to real-time telemetry, that we pull things off of our networks. Right, with there are a lot of tools out there now that can be API connected, interrogate all of these other tools that are out there on our environment, and pull back and tell us exactly what the configuration is, exactly how it's set up. We can see over time how things are being changed and what is inducing or reducing risk in our environment. To me, nirvana in a risk management world is if I can look at a dashboard and go, if we're making a change to an application or to a system, can I look at that change on a before and after standpoint in real time, near real time, and look at that and go, wow, that really moved the needle, or that didn't do anything, or it made us worse, right? So if I can answer that question quickly, it's making me move. It's making me move in a way that it helps me actually guide the overall strategy of the entire business and the cybersecurity world, a program and thing. All right. See, we've got our first question come in here, so I just saw it pop up. What is the risk of a battleship attacking during the course of your business day and blasting through your firewall? Would that impact reputational risk and definitely financial risk, right? So I see that pop up there, Kim, and it's a great point, right? Uh, those battleships a lot of times though are much smaller. The battleship attack sometimes easy to see because it's big, it's large, it's noisy, and it's loud, right? I think the stuff that you have to be paying a lot more attention, you have to be paying, that risk is always there, right? And depending on your industry, that risk may be higher. But I think what you really got to worry about is those smaller frigates that are out there that you don't necessarily pick them up. They're not as loud, or worst case, it's a submarine that you may not know has been tracking you the entire time you're there and fires it and you didn't know that. So I think if you have a good risk management program, you've planned for the big, noisy, loud battleship, but you've also planned for the submarine that you didn't know was there. Any attack is going to cause reputational risk. Reputational risk is a very difficult thing to, it is one of the most difficult things to quantify. I do think in today's world, the announcement that you've had a data breach is not nearly as impactful as it has been in the past. And I think that's because we're getting a little bit of, hate to say it this way, but we're getting a little numb to just the sheer volume of that information that hits out there. We have got to be able to address that attack in a way that we know the data, and we've all seen this over the last few years. I'm sure you've seen companies that have responded to a breach and got the information. They may have been a little late getting the information out, but they made sure the information that they presented to the public was concise. It was clear that this is what they know now. This is what we believe has happened, and this is what it is. And then we've also seen the flip side of that, which is, I think, much worse for reputational risk, is making a hurried announcement, going, not really understanding what's happened, not really having a great understanding of how bad it is, and not being able to measure that response, speak to it in measured tone. I think we've seen that causes more reputational risk than the actual breach itself did, right? Because if you have a poor communication plan and a poor response and you don't fully understand what the full impact of that breach is, and you run out and tell everybody that, oh well, it wasn't as bad as we thought, and it was just a small breach, and then you come back 2 weeks later and go, oh well, you know actually we were wrong, it's much larger than we knew. I think you're much better off coming out and saying what we know today is that this system was impacted. It may have impacted up to X amount of customer records. We're still investigating. We plan a regular release or public address to let people know where that's going. So I think that's one thing around the reputational risk. Um, all right. Um, got another question that just came in here. Says, the prime what would your company did it resulted in a battle? I'm trying to decipher this question. Sorry, guys. The way it's worded is I'm just reading through it here. How do you avoid boards and management from being desensitized from the inherent high cyber risk rating for the last decade without having any significant events? So uh, the way you avoid that is you get into, and this goes into how we measure and monitor, or how we measure and report risk, right? There's a baseline of risk for cyber, right? Everybody knows there's a lot of cyber attacks going on. There's just a lot of risk there. The way you keep the board from being desensitized to it is you're not constantly running in there going, the sky is falling, and that, you know, bad guys are doing bad things, and we've got to spend all this money, and we got to do all this. What you have to get to is we have our we have these identified risks. We are measuring them in this way that we've all agreed upon on how we're going to measure this, right? We know what our high risk applications are. We know where our high risk data is. We know what controls we have in place, right? So I have least privileged access, I have encryption, I have segmentation. Let's take ransomware. Let's take a big ransomware attack against my company. I'm going to use that for a simple thing. So if I look at it, it's a customer facing application that does financial transaction or banking transactions, financial transactions. And then what I have to do is I kind of look and go, okay, well, it's public exposed. It has sensitive data. So it's probably one of our most sensitive applications. So let's classify that as a class 1 application that is highly sensitive. And we know we should have a stack of things that we say any class 1 application must have: least privileged, MFA. It should have encryption on it. It should be segmented. It should be a multi-tiered application. So, and have that segmentation set up. We should have all the right logging and monitoring in place. We should have all the alerting set up. So these are the stack that we've determined as the things that we're going to do to mitigate risk and limit our exposure on that, right? So now then our incident response plan should be based around, we should be able to say we feel pretty confident that our level 1 application is protected, right? But what we now can do is go, oh, we found a new risk that we hadn't accounted for in our other controls. We go to the board with that data going, we have found a new risk that could impact this revenue stream. And this is what it's going to cost us, not only in money, but this is what it's going to cost us in time to mitigate this risk, right? And that is how you keep them from getting desensitized just to all the noise out there. You make sure that you're only talking to them about things that we know about, things that we feel are inducing a new risk or exposing us to a new risk, and this is how we're going to fix it, and this is how long we're going to fix it, and this is what the revenue at risk is, and this is what the cost is, right? So as long as the cost to fix something is not equal to or greater than the revenue at risk, you can normally sell that as part of your program. If you go in and go, I'm protecting $100 worth of risk, but I need to spend $5,000 to protect that $100 of revenue, the business is most likely probably going to make a decision to not do that because they feel that the impact does the cost of doing business is that risk, right? So it's getting it down to where you're talking to their language. That's the only way, because if you're constantly in there telling them we got to do all these things, and I think that's been one of the biggest problems with board reporting, right? Is if you're speaking in general speed, I'm gonna call it speeds and feeds, as we, and probably showing my age at this point, but if we're talking the very technical jargon, they are going to become desensitized to it. But if you're coming in there with measurable numbers that say we have these risks that impacts this revenue stream at this value, and we're going to spend this much money and time to protect that, and these are all the things that we got in place, and this is the data that we have, that keeps them from getting desensitized. That's the only way I know to do it. So how important is the organization culture and personal training compared to security frameworks applications? um that's the latest question that come in there. um so it's hugely important. um and that's a big part of, I think, our jobs as security leaders, is to help the organization understand that we do need a cultural shift, and making sure that our teams are trained on not just not just cybersecurity, our typical annual cybersecurity training, right? Getting a risk appetite understanding from the business and helping them shift that culture is probably my primary job. It's any senior leader's job, is helping them understand why it is important that we have top-down support, and that we need an organizational culture that thinks of everyone is a cybersecurity sensor. Cybersecurity, they're part of, it's a team, right? This is a team sport, and albeit full contact occasionally, it does require everyone in the company to understand why we are doing what we're doing. And if we can get the culture to shift and think in those ways, that we are all trying to lower our risk. And if we lower our risk, hopefully what comes out of that is we're increasing our revenue, we're increasing our comfort, our customer confidence in what we are doing, and we are able to communicate those capabilities in a way that increases that confidence, then what you hope for is that revenue goes up, that the business is doing better, that we're retaining our employees because they all feel like they're part of they're part of the solution, and that they see that we are trying to do things in a way that helps us move forward. I think that's a huge part of this. And because if you've got where I've seen sometimes your worst offenders of risky behavior is actually your cybersecurity team or your infrastructure or your IT operations teams, then you definitely have got the wrong culture in place. And it's your job to go in and help them explain that. It's also your job to keep them from thinking that hi, I'm here from the security team and I'm here to help. Right. So you want to be partners with them. You want them to understand why what they're doing is risk. But a big piece of that is talking to the business leader and the board and understanding what their risk appetite is. Right. If you can get that established up front, that helps you build a package that shows based on what they think, what their risk appetite is. And again, that sometimes it really gets down to a revenue versus money spent. They may be willing to spend up to equal the revenue to protect it. they may be willing to spend up to 75% of that revenue stream to fix it. They may be only willing to spend 10%. And I'm simplifying for sure, but figuring out that risk appetite is a big part of it. And the frameworks, like I said, frameworks are starting point. To kind of answer the second half of this, the frameworks are what you should be able to look at and go, these are the things that make up a good risk management program. And then you're going to have to tweak it for your business's risk appetite, for your systems. It is it's a very complicated thing to implement a framework, but if you have cultural buy-in and understand this is how we're going to approach it, this is what our acceptable risk tolerance level is, then you can start moving forward with it. So, all right. How do you go about getting external stakeholders to be engaged in the process? So my approach to that is building a relationship, right? Part of this is me having regular meetings with these external stakeholders and me talking through what my vision is for a risk management program, what my vision is for how we're going to report this up, what my vision is for how we're going to measure this. I meet with them on a regular basis. Depending on schedules and everything like that, I try to meet at a minimum quarterly with senior stakeholders and walk through what we are looking at from a risk program right now. If there's big changes going on, I may increase that frequency a little bit to maybe monthly or bi-monthly. But what I am trying to do is make sure we are communicating clearly on where we see risk are, what we're trying to accomplish, why it's important to the company, why it's important to them personally, right? How it, in some cases, it's how that affects their PBO objective, their personal bonus objectives, right? You gotta help them understand how it impacts them moving forward. But it's building that relationship, it's that open communication, it's taking the questions and having the conversation to where they are comfortable coming to you and saying, hey, we've noticed something that we don't know what quite to do with it, how we're going to approach this. And the worst thing I can be is, oh my God, that's the worst thing that I've ever heard. And it's and I've seen guys do this. I've seen people do this in our community too much. Is the first thing that may come out of somebody's mouth is, well, that is you and your team are idiots. You've done something stupid. It's the worst thing that you can do, right? What you need to do then is say, okay, let's all get together. Let's talk through this. Let's figure out what we can do to reduce this risk and how we're going to track going forward. Because if you make them feel dumb for bringing something to you or berate them in a way, they're never going to come back to you. They're never going to come back to you, and you're never going to have that conversation again. And you have shot yourself in the foot as how to run a risk program. So, all right. A general approach to estimate the impact of a given risk so the focus does not turn into interrogating the estimate, but rather puts the focus on inherent risk based on reasonable financial estimate. So the way that I have done this, and this is very important, as you are figuring out how to measure impact, right? There's a form, everybody knows the formulas out there for getting up to impact, right? It's a basic place to start. But what you've really got to do is whoever the owner of that risk is, whether it's a business leader, whether it's a information security leader, whether it's an IT leader, whoever the person is who's going to own that risk, you have to sit down with them ahead of time and talk about what that impact is, right? And how I'm going to measure what data I am using, how I'm looking at that data, how I am measuring the impact, right? And to get that estimate of it. Uh, you know, when we're having those conversations, if because the one of the first things that I've seen uh is if you go to a CIO, for example, uh, and you go to the CIO and you say, well, uh I have looked at the data. I think that we're missing this, and this is going to cost us uh X amount of loss, and the impact of it and the likelihood of it is really high. And I just go in there and I start spewing that stuff off. The first thing they're going to tell you is that they think the numbers or the data that you collected is incorrect, right? Because in you've now come at them and they feel like you are accusing them of doing something, right? And that's unfortunately when we start talking about risk and we start talking about how we're measuring it, it does sometimes come across as accusing, or the way when if you don't approach it easily and have a good conversation with them, it comes across as you're accusing them of being negligent in their and what they're doing. So I have found that if I can come to them and say, I have found um, we have this problem, right? Uh, the probability of this based on everything that we've seen in the industry today, right? So I'm going to use ransomware again because it's easy to pick on. Uh, the probability of ransomware hitting your company is pretty high, right? Uh, the impact of that, based on all the other mitigating factors you may have a moderate, let's call it a moderate impact from that event, right? So that is our inherent risk, right? Because maybe we're missing segmentation. So we're missing segmentation, our data is not encrypted, and just the probability of somebody getting an email with a ransomware link in it is really high, right? So we've got a pretty high inherent risk. So now I'm going to use that data to start having a conversation around, well, if we implement, we've already got, we've got our tools that are trying to limit our email front. Maybe we tweak that a little bit, but here's where we really need to spend some money. We need to spend effort on segmentation. And this is where our segmentation falls down. It's desktops have direct access to database backends, and we should isolate desktops from database backends, for example, right? So now I've been able to explain what that inherent risk is. I've also been able to explain them what we're looking at, and now I've got a cost that goes to what this would impact the revenue and what it's going to cost to fix us, and then what the timeline is on that. So if you can have those conversations and you've all agreed on that ahead of time, it gets away from the you surprise me with this and you're trying to make me look bad in front of the board. And that's really what my general approach is that we all agree on what we're measuring. We talk through that risk, and then when the numbers do go up and I'm asking for budget or I'm asking for a major project to remediate a risk, nobody has been surprised by it. It was all agreed upon how we're measuring it, how we're communicating before it ever goes to that board level to ask for the money. And that puts the focus on what it should be on, is we're trying to eliminate an inherent risk problem out there, and not I'm trying to throw you under the bus. So hopefully that's helpful. All right. Comment on edge security. Uh, Boy, that's one of those that there's a lot of things out there. I think depends on what we're considering edge or what your edge is. But I mean, in reality, we're talking, um, I think probably some of the biggest tools we got today are going to be your controls around the data and controls around access, right? So your MFA, your least privileged, your making sure that data is encrypted correctly and that you kind of know where things are flowing, right? And having that, because the edge is constantly growing further and further out. We've gotten rid of a lot of what I would consider uh, traditional walls built around our stuff, and our data is everywhere and it's moving everywhere. So my opinion is the more I've encrypted it and the better my access controls on it, I am limiting what can happen once it moves out past our edge that we have today. So I know that's kind of probably maybe not the exact question you guys were looking for, but I think that edge security becomes a lot of things, and we could probably spend an entire keynote just talking about edge security. AI, friend or foe? Uh, well, uh, we talking actual AI or just machine learning? So, because my experience has been that up until recently, uh, AI is just some type of machine learning or uh, deep learning or whatever we're going to call it. It is a friend, uh, as long as you understand and have a good process going into it. It can become a foe very quickly if you just throw it in without a good thought process around it, right? AI and a bad process, or AI and bad practices, just make things worse. And if it's making decisions based off of bad things that you've let it learn, then it can become a foe really quickly. It also allows stuff to happen at a much faster pace than you've probably been used to. Um, but if you have a well-defined process, you have the right gates in place right now with AI, where your trust levels are, it definitely can be a friend to you. But you need to approach it, I think, with you need to approach it a little bit timidly, and you need to make sure that it's not something that you just see as the panacea that it's going to be or being sold to you. I think AI still has a long way to go. And I do think ultimately it's going to be the thing that helps us greatly down the road, and it's improving, but it's also still there's also still a lot of problems with it. Not just the problem with AI is it's a trust question, and I don't fully trust it. I'm just not all in on it yet. For risk, any advice on resources you can point us to would be good template for putting numbers into risk ranking. Like I said, NIST has got some pretty good information out there. Um, Look at the FAIR model. I don't recommend going all in FAIR 100%. I think anytime you're looking at a statistical model, if you feed it the right amount of data, the right number of times, and in the right way, you can kind of get it to say whatever you want to. But there are some great pieces of data out there that it's a good place to start, and then you can kind of go from there. There is a book out there called How to Measure. Let me pull the title up exactly, because I do think it's a great book. And I've read it. Let me pull it up real quick. Sorry. There's a book called Measure What Matters. That's one I would suggest looking at. Um, There's also a book called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. That's another good resource. Um, those are a couple of books that I suggest you look at, especially if you're in into this risk world and you're starting to put these numbers together, because you can take a lot of the data from there and use it to start figuring out what you want to build as a key risk hand indicator and how you want to measure it. Um, so but there's also some stuff out there that you can find. I think there's some other ones out there that another great book to read, because it kind of gets you thinking about where risk may be coming from in data. It's a book called Data and Goliath. But it's I think Bruce Schreiner wrote that one. It is a really good book that gets you thinking about risk in ways that you may not have. And it's talking about thinking about security in ways you may not have thought about it. But that's another great book I would go look at. Um, and then I'd be happy to just I'll throw this out there. The risk ranking thing, I think uh, you can do some basic stuff based off of just, I think, basic template for risk ranking applications and data is how's it connected to the outside world, or is it connected to the outside world? Who has access to it and how are they accessing it? Um, the type of data that it is, right? Data type. Is it how sensitive is it? And because depending on the type of data and how sensitive it is, it could be there could be different levels of fines or different regulatory issues with that data. So that's you got regulatory risk that has to be measured off what type of data that is. Then then you start looking at some of the security controls around it. Is it encrypted? How's it encrypted? You know, do we have a great data flow, know where the data is moving, stuff like that. So those are some of the basic things I would look at from just purely from how to start putting a risk order to your applications, right? Um, I thinking back to previous jobs, class we use the 4 class system for applications. If it was a class one, was as it was open open to the internet, and by open to the internet means it was a customer facing application. Uh, it held sensitive data. It uh, and that's the two basic things that made it a class one, right? And then we looked at the security controls that were stacked around that. And if it had MFA, you can look at some simple things. Did it have a WAF in front of it? Does it have MFA? Is it encrypted? Is it in a three tier architecture that kept application web front end, application back, and database back end segmented? Is it fully segmented away? So those are some basic things you can start looking at and start putting together on how to start putting risk rankings together around your applications. And part of that's also going to be the revenue that application makes, right? If you're trying to get into actual risk quantification, you're going to need to know how much revenue that application makes. You've also got the vulnerabilities that are open, patch levels that are open on that. So those are some of the basic things as I start stacking together and looking at an application and determining what the risk is. So uh, any API security key controls. The big thing I can tell you about that, if you're not paying attention to APIs, you are woefully behind. Because however many APIs you think you have in your environment, you probably have 100 times more than that. And API is great. Most of us companies out there, we're trying to monetize those, right? So we're moving important data and we're sharing data around. Uh, you know, You should have a life cycle plan built around APIs. You should have documentation requirements around APIs. You should have key certificate controls around APIs, as well as some of your basic stuff like rate limiting and, you know, uh, just versioning control of those APIs. You should have some of that. You got to build a whole program around that because an API can do a lot of damage. It can move a lot of sensitive data to a place it's not supposed to go if someone is able to take control of that API or get in the middle of it and redirect or change to it. It can hurt you in a lot of ways very quickly. And like I said, I have never met somebody or talked to anybody or had a conversation with anybody that goes, yeah, we were looking into APIs and we thought we had 100, but we only found out we had 50. Everybody I talked to has said, well, we thought we had 100 APIs and turns out we had 3,000 APIs. That's typically the way that conversation goes. So you really do need to be building a program around API security. I mean, it's important enough that OWASP has its own top 10 for APIs. There's a lot of overlap between the regular OWASP top 10, but the ordering of what is the most important thing in that top 10 is different when you look at the OWASP top 10 for APIs. So yeah, you definitely have to be paying attention to that today, and I don't see that slowing down. I actually think it's going to become a much bigger part of our daily lives. What do you say to the board, senior leadership, if they tell you that they can't afford the recommendations you suggest? This is always an interesting question. It always comes up. My answer to this is that is their decision. It's not my decision, right? Uh, uh, our jobs as security and risk leaders is to illuminate risk and make sure that everybody understands what the risk is. It's the business's decision and their responsibility to either accept that risk or fix that risk, right? What I do with board and senior leadership, if they can't afford it, is then we have to start having a conversation on one, if you're going to accept this as a business risk and it's going to be out there, we're going to document it and you guys are going to get it. It's going to, and if it went to the board anyway, it's going to be in the board. It's going to be in the board minutes, right? So it's going to be officially documented. But you've got to get them, basically, you're letting them know that you've identified the risk, you've shown them what the risk is, and they're signing off saying that they are accepting that as part of their risk appetite. Now, very rarely, if it's a serious enough, does it get to that. What you may have to do is come up with and what I've always tried to do is come up with, this would fix it 100%. This will mitigate it to a certain point, right? And then this is the cost of doing nothing, right? Because doing nothing is always an option. So I think if you go in at least with a couple of options that say, well, we can do this and this remediates the problem, or we could do this, it still exposes us to X amount of likelihood that this is going to happen. And or or we do nothing and this is what the cost is. So I mean, it really gets down to a numbers game, and you just tell them where it's at, and if they're going to accept it, you let them know that, hey, I have let you know what the risk is. I've let you know what the possible impact is, and if the business decides to not fix it, it's documented. And I mean, guys, we don't live in a perfect world. We've all been through that conversation where we want to get something done and we're told we can't do it. That the budget isn't there, that the risk isn't there, that the resources are not there, or that they just don't feel like it's important. I've had conversations with folks and seen it personally where, let's take a PCI assessment fine, right? So PCI assessment, the PCI fines are, truthfully, they're pretty low, right? They really don't for large companies doing PCI assessments, I have seen too many times that the cost of just paying the fine for a period of time instead of fixing the problem is actually less expensive, and it just becomes part of doing business that you're paying a fine. Now, that's been many years ago. We're getting more and more into where the credit card companies now are getting a little more, hey, if you don't fix this, we're not going to allow you to keep going. So, but that is, unfortunately, that is part of the job. And you once you get into one of these seats, you better be ready to be disappointed on a regular basis on what the company thinks is important and what you think are important. But if you can set those expectations and have those conversations openly and make sure that everybody's aware that you don't agree with their decision, but you will do everything in your power to make it as a least of an event as possible. So if it does happen, and that you will be paying, well, maybe we add extra monitoring, maybe we add extra controls, but it's ultimately their decision. So somebody commented, get them to sign off on the risk through the exception process. Well, that is part of that, right? So you are getting the business to, if they don't want to buy it, they are signing off on a risk exception. Basically, it's a known, published, documented risk. If it's made it to the board and they said they're not going to fix it, it is a risk exception, right? And like I said, you should have a formal risk exception process inside your company. Depending on how many levels that may be and where that may hit is, dependent on company size and maturity level. But if it's in the board presentation, that makes it into the board minutes, which are public record. And most companies don't want that to happen. So you're probably going to get that handled at a much lower level before it ever hits the board. Just as a FYI. Any emerging risk, and I know we're running up on time here, so I think the thing is I think insider threat risk is going to keep. We're going to see more and more of that, and it's not. I'm not saying that employees are doing more malicious things. What I'm saying is the attacks against employees, people finding out where you are, what company you are, and targeting folks at your company to get something done from an insider perspective. I think that we're going to keep seeing a huge. I think that's just going to keep growing. API risk is. And I hate to say it's an emerging risk because it's been around for a while, but I think people are paying more and more attention to it. Um, you know, the I'm trying to think if anything. I mean, the problem is most of what we're seeing is still the same thing. I think nation state stuff is for certain industries is we're going to keep seeing that going up. If you're doing business in certain, especially in certain Eastern European or areas over there, you've probably increased your visibility to nation state stuff, but you're probably never the primary target. You're probably collateral from something else that's going on. I think, ransomware is definitely not an emergent risk, but it's going to continue to be a problem, and I think it's going to just keep getting worse because it's easy. Um, and I still think probably we're going to see more and new things coming from the third party vendor risk side of the house. I think that is probably one of the bigger things we're going to see, because they're effective. They also are able. It's a one to many, so it can get a lot of stuff. So if you've not been paying attention to supply chain risk or vendor risk, you really do need to be looking at that and watching that area, because it's also going to continue to get to be a primary attack and coming out. Those are probably the big things. Well, guys, I know I am I'm getting close to getting the hook here. Uh, Probably if anybody has any other questions, we probably got 2 minutes to get one in here. If not, I want to thank everybody for allowing me to speak. I've enjoyed it as always. If you have any other questions or have stuff you want to get with me one on one, I am pretty easy to find on LinkedIn or in other communities out here. So please reach out. Don't be shy. I will share what I can and what I think. I've never been shy about that. So, but I appreciate the opportunity to get to speak with all of you guys and hopefully get to see you face to face somewhere in the near future. I'll probably be, I know I'm going to be around at RSA. I know I'm going to probably be around at some regional events here in the next few months. So look forward to seeing everybody that I can in person at a future event. I appreciate it.